Amidst a raging storm, the flickering neon light of a roadside motel illuminated a cruel scene. A young manager was loudly berating an elderly janitor, who simply bowed his head in silence. A reluctant guest, the veteran Sean, only wanted shelter for the night, but he froze when he witnessed it. He could never have imagined that the man being humiliated before him was the key to a devastating truth buried for 5 long years. Please support us by subscribing to the Voice of Paws channel to uncover the secret behind this fateful encounter. Where are you listening to this story from? The asphalt of US Route 2 stretched before Sean's truck like a long gray sigh, endless and empty. For weeks, the vast, lonely landscapes of Montana had been his only real scenery, a canvas of sprawling plains and distant, jagged mountains under a sky so big it felt like another ocean. Sean, a man in his early 40s, kept his hands loose on the steering wheel. His tall frame was lean but solid, a remnant of a life that demanded physical readiness, but his shoulders carried a new kind of weight now. His short brown hair was showing threads of silver at the temples, and his face, which might have been called kind, was etched with a deep, unshakable weariness. He wore an old brown leather jacket over a faded navy and gray plaid shirt, a uniform for a man who belonged nowhere. Beside him, Knox lay sleeping in the passenger seat. The German Shepherd, a handsome 4-year-old with a thick coat of silver gray and white, was the one constant in Sean's drifting world. His breathing was a soft, steady rhythm against the hum of the engine, a peaceful sound in the truck's quiet cab. Knox was a calm soul, a grounding presence whose loyalty was as vast and silent as the Montana sky. He was the only anchor Sean had left. The rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement was a hypnotic drumbeat, and for a moment it wasn't the road Sean saw. It was a flash of dust and sun, the roar of an engine not his own, a shout swallowed by chaos. He blinked hard, the ghost of sweat on his brow despite the chill. The memories were like that, sharp fragments of glass that worked their way to the surface without warning. He was running. He knew that much. Running from the man he had been, from the things he had seen, from a silence back home that had grown louder than any explosion. But the longer he drove, the more it felt like he was just driving in circles within his own mind. The sky, which had been a flat, neutral gray all morning, began to darken with an unnerving speed. A single snowflake hit the windshield, then another, then a dozen. Within minutes, the air was a thick, swirling vortex of white. The wind howled, rocking the heavy truck, and the world beyond his windshield dissolved into a formless, furious blizzard. Visibility dropped to near zero. Sean's knuckles turned white on the wheel. This was no longer a journey, it was a fight for control. Through the blinding snow, a faint, flickering light pulsed in the distance. It was weak, pathetic, but it was something, hope, or at least a reprieve. As he drew closer, a sign materialized from the storm, its neon letters struggling to stay lit. The Weary Traveler Motel. It looked as tired as its name suggested, a low-slung building with peeling paint and an air of quiet desperation. Sean hated it instantly, but the storm gave him no choice. He slowed the truck, his heart sinking with a familiar dread, and turned into the unplowed parking lot. The storm had him trapped. Sean left Knox in the warmth of the truck, pulling his jacket tighter against the biting wind as he walked towards the office. The inside of the lobby was somehow colder and more miserable than the storm outside. A single fluorescent light hummed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the worn linoleum floor. The air was thick with the smell of damp carpet and stale cigarette smoke. Behind a scratched counter, a young man with a sour face and a thin mustache was leaning forward, his voice sharp and loud. "I told you to mop this floor an hour ago," the manager snapped. "Are you deaf or just slow? I don't pay you to stand around." His anger was directed at an old, thin man in a faded blue janitor's uniform. The man's shoulders were slumped in a permanent posture of defeat, his gray hair thin and wispy. He held a dirty mop in his hands and kept his eyes fixed on the floor, saying nothing as the manager's insults washed over him. Sean felt a familiar pang of irritation. He didn't want to witness this petty cruelty, this small-town sadness. He just wanted a key, a room, and 4 walls to shut out the world. He paid in cash, grabbed the key, and walked out without another glance. Back in the truck, he started the engine to keep the heat running. "Just for the night, boy," he said quietly. But Knox wasn't settling down. The dog was suddenly tense, standing with his paws on the dashboard, his body rigid. A low whine escaped his throat as he stared intently out the passenger side window. Sean followed his gaze. The old janitor was now outside, slowly dragging a large, overflowing trash can towards a dumpster near the edge of the property. The wind whipped snow around him, carrying with it a scent that was lost to Sean, but not to the dog. Knox began to scratch lightly at the glass, his whine growing more insistent, more desperate. "Knox, settle," Sean commanded, but the dog ignored him, his eyes locked on the old man's struggling figure. This was not like Knox. His friend was usually calm, patient. This strange agitation, this intense focus, made Sean pause. He leaned over, trying to see what had captured his dog's entire being. The janitor finished his task and began the slow walk back towards the motel office. As he passed under the dim, yellow porch light, he straightened his back for a moment to shield his face from the wind. The light caught his features, carving them out of the stormy darkness. Time stopped. The face was gaunt, the cheeks hollowed by hardship, but the line of his jaw, the shape of his brow, it was all terrifyingly familiar. It was the face of his father, Arthur. For a long moment, Sean just sat in his truck, the engine rumbling while the world outside fell silent in his mind. Then, moving as if through water, he opened the door and stepped out into the storm. His father, Arthur, was still frozen under the porch light, his face a pale mask of disbelief and shame. As Sean approached, Arthur took an involuntary step back, his gaze dropping to the snow-dusted ground. He looked like a man searching for a hole to disappear into. "Dad?" Sean's voice was hoarse, a word he hadn't spoken in 5 years. "Sean," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy with disuse. "You shouldn't be here." He started to turn away, to retreat back into the shadows of his new life. "No," Sean said, his own voice firm, cutting through the wind. "We're not doing this. We need to talk. My room." It wasn't a request. Arthur hesitated for a second, his shoulders slumping in final surrender, and gave a slow, defeated nod. The motel room was small, cold, and smelled of antiseptic. Sean closed the door, and the silence that filled the space was immense, a physical weight that pressed down on both of them. It was a silence built from 5 years of missed calls, of unspoken fears, of a son's pain and a father's pride. Arthur sat stiffly on the edge of the cheap bedspread, his calloused hands clasped together, his eyes studying the faded carpet. Sean remained by the door, his own body rigid, trapped. He had crossed a country to run from his past, only to find it here, in this suffocating room, looking older and more broken than he could have ever imagined. Seeing the hopeless impasse, Sean turned, opened the door, and gave a soft whistle. A moment later, Knox padded into the room, shaking the snow from his gray and white coat. The dog paused, his intelligent eyes moving from Sean to the stranger on the bed. He sensed the tension, the profound sadness that hung in the air. Slowly, deliberately, Knox walked not to Sean, his master, but to Arthur. He stopped before the old man and gently nudged his head against Arthur's tightly clasped hands. Arthur flinched, but didn't pull away. Knox let out a soft, low whimper, a sound of pure, simple comfort. That was all it took. The small, selfless act of kindness from an animal shattered the dam Arthur had built inside himself for years. A shudder racked his thin frame, and a raw, ragged sob escaped his lips. Tears he had long held back now streamed down his weathered face. Seeing his father break, truly break, melted the ice in Sean's own chest. The anger and confusion gave way to a deep, aching need to understand. He took a step forward. "Dad?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. "What really happened?" Arthur took a long, shuddering breath. His gaze lost somewhere in the space between them, a place filled with ghosts. Knox, sensing the shift, rested his heavy head on the old man's knee, a silent offering of support. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken whisper, the sound of a story that had been trapped for too long. "It started right after you left for your first tour," he began, his words slow and heavy. "Your mother, she got sick." At first, the doctors weren't sure what it was, but it was aggressive. It was bad, Sean. He paused, swallowing hard. "Every time we talked on the phone, I lied. I told you she was fine, that we were all fine. I couldn't put that burden on you. Your job was to survive, to come home in one piece. I couldn't let you be distracted, worrying about us." He looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained from work he was never meant to do. The medical bills started piling up. It was a mountain we couldn't climb. The insurance didn't cover enough, never does. I was so desperate. A man I knew from the business told me about an investment, a sure thing that would solve all our problems. I was a fool. I was a desperate fool. I poured everything we had into it, the business, the savings, all of it. His voice cracked. "It was a scam. They took everything. The business our family built for 30 years was gone in a month." The deepest wave of pain yet washed over his face. "The stress made your mother worse. She declined so fast after that. The final tragedy, she passed away in the hospital. I was trying to sort out another bill, another final notice. I wasn't there. She died alone, Sean." The last word was a choked sob. After the funeral, there was nothing left. No wife. The bank took the house, no hope. I looked at myself in the mirror, and all I saw was a failure. How could I let my son, a United States Marine, come home to this? To a father who lost everything? Who couldn't even be there when his own wife died? His eyes, glistening with tears, finally met Sean's. So I ran. I sold what little I had left, packed a bag, and just disappeared. I couldn't bear for you to see what I had become. The story settled in the small room, thick and heavy like dust. Sean listened to the last of his father's words and felt none of the anger he might have expected. There was no rage, no sense of betrayal. Instead, a cold, crushing wave of guilt washed over him, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. For 5 years, he had imagined 1,000 scenarios, many of them casting his father as a man who had simply moved on, who had not cared enough to stay in touch. He had never once imagined a truth this painful. He had never considered that the silence was not just his father's. It had been his, too. "I didn't call," Sean said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. He finally moved from the doorway and sank into the room's single, shabby armchair. "After I got out, I should have called, but I couldn't." Arthur looked at him, his tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "Why, son?" Sean looked at his hands, seeing tremors that weren't there. "The fighting doesn't just stop when you come home, Dad. I had my own war to fight, right here." He tapped his temple. The nightmares were constant. I'd wake up covered in sweat, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. During the day, there was this anxiety, this feeling that something terrible was about to happen at any second. I felt lost, like a ghost. The man who left home never really came back. He finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting his father's. Making a phone call felt like climbing a mountain. So I got in my truck and I just drove. I thought if I kept moving, I could outrun it all. I was running from my own shadows, and in doing so, I ran right past you. The last confession hung in the air, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with a shared, tragic understanding. They were not a negligent father and an abandoned son. They were two men, wounded in different wars, who had both retreated into themselves out of pride and out of pain. One was trapped by shame, the other by trauma. In the sterile anonymity of that rundown motel room, They finally saw each other clearly, stripped of all pretense, and recognized the same deep sorrow in each other's eyes. As this new, fragile peace settled, Knox stood up. He walked from his spot beside Arthur and lay down on the worn carpet in the space between the two men, resting his chin on his paws. He let out a soft sigh, a sound of contentment. He was no longer offering comfort to one or the other, but had become a quiet, warm bridge between them, a silent testament to a reunion that was finally, painfully beginning. The next morning, Sean woke to a profound silence. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a quiet so complete it felt sacred. He pulled back the thin curtain, and the world outside was reborn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape of brilliant white snow under a sky of the deepest, clearest blue. The sun was rising, casting long shadows and making the fresh snow glitter as if it were made of diamonds. The air itself felt clean, washed new, and for the first time in years, the landscape outside seemed to match a newfound quiet inside his own heart. The storm within him had broken along with the one outside. He and Arthur packed their few things in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, not a heavy one. As they stood by Sean's truck, the crisp morning air cool on their faces, Sean knew what he had to do. He looked at his father, a man who seemed to have aged a decade in reverse overnight, the deep lines of shame and despair having softened into something like weary peace. Sean realized his victory wasn't in finding a villain to blame or a fortune to reclaim. The past was gone. The victory was standing right in front of him. "Dad," Sean said, his voice steady. "Come with me." Arthur looked at him, his expression uncertain. "I don't know where I'm going," Sean continued, meeting his father's gaze. "This road has been a circle for a long time, but I don't want to drive it alone anymore. We don't know where we'll end up, but we'll go together." A flicker of disbelief crossed Arthur's face, followed by a wave of emotion so powerful it made him sway. Hope. It was a feeling he thought he had buried long ago with his wife. He could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Sean opened the passenger door for him. As Arthur slowly settled into the seat, Knox, who had been waiting patiently, leaped into the cab with joyous energy. He didn't settle in the back or at Sean's feet. Instead, he pushed his way into the middle of the bench seat, planting himself firmly between father and son. He let his tongue loll out in a happy grin, his warm body a solid, living bridge connecting them. He looked at Arthur, then at Sean, as if to say that this was how it was always meant to be. As Sean started the engine, Arthur stared out the window at the vast, sunlit expanse of Montana. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a slow path down his weathered cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but one of overwhelming release. With Knox sitting proudly between them, Sean pulled the truck out of the motel lot and onto the clear highway. The truck was no longer a vessel for escape. It was now carrying a family, not running from a past, but driving steadily toward a new beginning, into the heart of the morning Sunday. Sometimes the greatest walls between us are not built of stone, but of silence, forged by pride and pain. It often takes a single moment of courage, or the simple, unwavering love of a loyal friend, to help us find our way back to each other. If the story of Sean and Arthur's new dawn touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our Voice of Paws family by subscribing. Every like and share helps these messages of hope travel a little further. We would love to read your own stories of reconnection in the comments. And your next journey is ready to begin, in the video that has just appeared on your screen.